My parents spent their entire retirement funding my brother's lifestyle for 30 years while I got nothing. They never expected what would happen next. My brother Rick never had to work for anything because my parents made sure of it. When we were kids, I had chores and Rick had excuses. I mowed lawns for pocket money while Rick got an allowance for existing. When I wanted a bike, I saved for 6 months. When Rick wanted a car at 16, Mom and Dad bought him one because walking was too hard for their special boy. They actually said special boy to his face like it was normal. I worked fast food to pay for college application fees while Rick got a full ride to private university courtesy of Mom and Dad's retirement savings. When he dropped out sophomore year to find himself, they said education wasn't for everyone and kept paying his rent anyway. When I graduated with honors from state school that I'd paid for myself, they didn't come because Rick had a bad day and needed support. Rick's bad day was a hangover, but that didn't matter to them. Rick lived at home until he was 28, not because he couldn't afford to move out, but because Mom did his laundry better than anyone else. Dad cooked his special meals because Rick had a sensitive stomach that only responded to Dad's cooking. They bought him a condo when he finally moved out because renting was throwing away money, but only for Rick, not for me who'd been renting since 18. When Rick couldn't make the mortgage payments, they covered them. When he couldn't pay utilities, they handled those too. When he totaled the car they'd given him, they bought another. When he totaled that one, they bought a third and hired him a driver, because clearly Rick wasn't meant to drive. The driver lasted 2 months before quitting because Rick treated him like garbage, but Mom and Dad started driving Rick everywhere instead. I built my own business while Rick played video games professionally, which meant he entered one tournament, lost immediately, and declared himself retired from competitive gaming. Mom and Dad funded his retirement at 31. They paid for his groceries, his insurance, his vacations, everything. When I asked why they never helped me, they said I was so capable I didn't need help. Rick needed them more. Rick started businesses with their money that failed instantly. A food truck that never got permits. A clothing line that was one t-shirt with his face on it. A cryptocurrency that was obviously a scam. Each failure cost them thousands, and each time they said Rick was learning valuable lessons. The valuable lesson seemed to be that Mom and Dad would always bail him out. When I got married, they gave us a blender. When Rick got engaged to a woman he'd known for 3 weeks, they paid for a destination wedding in Hawaii. When that marriage ended 4 months later, they paid for the divorce and Rick's therapy to deal with the trauma of being married briefly. They bought him another condo because the first one had memories. I had 3 kids and they visited twice a year. Rick got a dog and they visited weekly to help take care of it because pets were hard work. The dog ran away after a month because Rick forgot to close the gate, but Mom and Dad bought him another one. That one also ran away. So did the 3rd, 4th, and 5th. They stopped buying him dogs and just visited to keep him company instead. Then Mom and Dad got old. Dad had a heart attack at 70 and Mom developed dementia at 72. They needed care but had no money left because they'd spent everything on Rick. Their retirement savings, their equity, their investments, all gone into Rick's failures and comfort. They needed to move into assisted living, but the good places required financial proof and references from family members who'd take responsibility if payments stopped. They asked Rick to co-sign and provide a reference. Rick said he wasn't comfortable taking on that responsibility. He said he didn't understand legal documents and didn't want to sign something binding. He said they should ask me since I was good with paperwork. They came to me crying about how they had nowhere to go and Rick wouldn't help. I asked them why Rick, their special boy who they'd given everything, couldn't help the people who'd sacrificed everything for him. They said Rick wasn't good under pressure, and this was too much stress for him. Dad actually said those words while recovering from a heart attack. I asked if 30 years of paying Rick's way had prepared him for anything. They said I was being cruel about my brother's struggles. I asked what struggles those were exactly. They couldn't answer because Rick had never actually struggled with anything. I agreed to help them on one condition. I told my parents my condition was simple. Rick pays back every dollar they spent on him over the past 5 years before I'll help them with anything. They stared at me like I'd asked them to fly to the moon. My father's mouth opened and closed without sound. My mother gripped the arm of my couch like she might fall over. The silence stretched so long I could hear the kitchen faucet dripping in the next room. My father finally found his voice and started talking fast about how that was impossible and completely unfair to ask. I stood up and walked to my desk in the corner. I pulled out the notebook I'd been keeping for years. Every time they mentioned helping Rick with something, I wrote it down with the date and amount if they told me. I flipped through pages of entries going back 7 years. The conservative estimate for just the last 5 years came to over $200,000. I showed them the numbers. My father's face went red and he said I couldn't possibly know the exact amounts. I told him these were just the things they'd mentioned to me in passing, so the real number was probably higher. My mother started crying. She said Rick didn't have that kind of money, and where did I expect him to get it? I told her that was exactly my point. They could ask their special boy to figure it out the same way I figured out college and business and life without any help from them. My father stood up so fast his knees cracked. He said I was being cruel and they came here for help, not to be attacked. I stayed calm and told them I wasn't attacking anyone. just stating facts they'd created over 30 years. My mother kept crying and saying Rick couldn't pay them back because he didn't have anything. I asked whose fault that was. They left my house without another word. My father had to help my mother to the car because she was crying too hard to walk straight. I watched them drive away and felt nothing except tired. For 3 days, I didn't hear from them at all. Chloe found me staring at my phone on the second day. She sat down next to me and put her hand on my shoulder. She said I did the right thing even though it was harsh. Someone needed to hold Rick accountable finally, and my parents weren't going to do it. I asked if she thought I was being too mean. She reminded me about the blender they gave us for our wedding while Rick got a destination wedding in Hawaii. She reminded me about working 2 jobs to pay for college while Rick got a free ride and dropped out. She said being kind to people who hurt you just teaches them they can keep hurting you. On the 4th day, my phone rang. It was Rick calling me directly for the first time in 2 years. I answered, and he started screaming before I could say hello. He yelled about how I was trying to kill our parents by refusing to help them. He said I was heartless and cruel and always had to make everything about me. I put the phone on speaker and let him rant. He went on for 5 full minutes about what a terrible daughter and sister I was. When he finally stopped to breathe, I asked if he was planning to pay them back or help with their care. The line went quiet. Then he started yelling again about how I was twisting everything and making him the bad guy. I asked again about the $200,000. He hung up on me. 20 minutes later, my mother called. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her words. She begged me to change my mind because Rick was too stressed and it was hurting his health. I asked what about Dad's health after his heart attack. She said that was different. I asked how it was different. She couldn't answer. I told her I was sorry she was in this situation, but I wasn't changing my terms. If Rick couldn't pay back 5 years, he could start helping with their current care costs, and I would match whatever he put in every month. She said Rick didn't have money for that. I said then Rick needed to get a job like every other adult in the world. She hung up on me too. Another week went by with no contact from anyone. I went to work and came home and lived my normal life. Chloe asked if I was okay, and I told her I was better than I'd been in years. Then my phone rang at 2 in the morning. It was the hospital. My father had another heart attack. This one was smaller, but he was back in the ICU. The doctor told me the stress of their housing situation wasn't helping his recovery. I drove to the hospital still in my pajamas. My father looked worse than the last time I'd seen him. His skin was gray and he had tubes everywhere. The machines beeped steady rhythms around his bed. I sat in the chair next to him and he opened his eyes. He looked at me for a long time before speaking. He asked if I was really going to let them become homeless over my anger at Rick. I told him I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done being the only one who sacrifices anything in this family. He closed his eyes and a tear ran down his cheek. I stayed until visiting hours ended. The nurse told me my mother's dementia was getting worse. She kept asking for Rick and forgetting he wouldn't help. Then she got upset all over again when they reminded her. The nurse said it was hard to watch because she went through the same pain fresh every time she forgot. I asked if Rick had visited at all. The nurse checked the log and said no family except me had been there since my father was admitted. I drove straight from the hospital to the office of Declan Gregory, a social worker someone at the nurse's station recommended when I asked about emergency elder care placements. His office was in a building that needed new carpet and better lighting, but he answered his phone on the first ring and told me to come right over. Declan was maybe 50 with gray hair and tired eyes that said he'd seen every family disaster possible. I sat across from his desk and explained the whole situation while he took notes on a yellow legal pad. He asked for my parents' financial information, and I gave him everything I had, which wasn't much because they'd hidden most of it from me for years. He spent 20 minutes reviewing bank statements and medical records while I sat there feeling like I was back in the principal's office waiting to hear how bad things were. Finally, he looked up and said they qualified for some assistance programs, but the wait lists were long and the facilities that accepted those programs weren't great. He meant they were the places where people went when they had no other options. The ones with peeling paint and overworked staff and rooms that smelled like institutional food and sadness. I asked how long the wait lists were, and he said 6 months minimum, maybe longer depending on bed availability. My father didn't have 6 months to wait in a house facing foreclosure, with no one to help him and my mother wandering around forgetting where she was. Declan asked about family support, and I told him the truth about Rick, and the 30 years of enabling, and the $200,000, and the refusal to help now that they actually needed him. He nodded like he'd heard this exact story 100 times before. He said the enabling parent dynamic often led to crises exactly like this one, where the child who got everything couldn't function when the money stopped, and the child who got nothing had to step in and fix everything. He said it happened more than people thought, and it almost never ended well for anyone involved. I asked what my options were, and he said I could try private pay facilities while waiting for assistance approval, or I could take them into my home temporarily, or I could let the state handle placement, which would be faster, but would mean even worse facilities than the ones on the wait lists. None of those options sounded good, but I told him I'd think about it and get back to him. I left his office feeling worse than when I arrived because now I had actual numbers and timelines instead of just abstract worry. My next stop was Lucas Burton, a financial advisor my business accountant recommended when I told her I needed someone to examine my parents' finances. Lucas worked out of a nice office in a building with actual working air conditioning and carpet that didn't smell like mold. He was younger than Declan, maybe 40, with the kind of confident handshake that made you think he knew what he was doing. I gave him all the financial documents I'd managed to collect, and he spread them across his desk like he was looking at evidence of a crime. He asked questions about their spending patterns and Rick's history, and how long this had been going on. I answered everything honestly because there was no point in hiding how bad it was anymore. He worked through the papers for almost an hour while I checked emails on my phone and tried not to think about how much this consultation was costing. When he finally finished, he looked at me with an expression that was half pity and half professional concern. He said my parents had made catastrophic financial decisions for decades and now faced serious consequences that couldn't be easily fixed. They'd cashed out life insurance policies that would have covered end-of-life care. They'd taken out a second mortgage they couldn't pay that was about to go into foreclosure. They had $17,000 in credit card debt spread across 6 cards, all of it from funding Rick's lifestyle over the past 3 years alone. Lucas showed me statements proving they'd been taking cash advances to pay Rick's rent and buying him groceries on credit cards they couldn't afford to pay off. He said the best option at this point was Medicaid placement once they spent down their remaining assets, which wouldn't take long given their current burn rate. He estimated they had maybe 3 months of money left if they kept spending at their current rate, less if any emergency expenses came up. I asked if there was any way to recover money from Rick legally, and Lucas said probably not unless I could prove fraud, which would be hard since my parents had given him everything willingly. He said the best I could do was cut Rick off completely and focus on getting my parents into a sustainable care situation before they had literally nothing left. I thanked him and paid his consultation fee and left feeling like I'd just watched someone perform an autopsy on my parents' entire financial life. My last appointment that day was with Dashiell Holloway, an attorney who specialized in elder law and estate planning. His office was in the same building as Lucas, which made sense because they probably referred clients to each other all the time. Dashiell was older, maybe 60, with white hair and reading glasses that hung on a chain around his neck. He listened to my explanation of the situation and asked to see the medical documentation for both parents. I showed him the hospital records from my father's heart attacks and the evaluation notes from my mother's dementia diagnosis. He read everything carefully and made notes in a leather portfolio that looked expensive. Then he explained the legal process for getting power of attorney, given my mother's dementia and my father's health crisis. He said I'd need current medical documentation proving they couldn't make sound decisions about their own care. He said I'd need to file paperwork with the court, and there would be a hearing where a judge would determine if power of attorney was appropriate. He asked if other family members would contest it, and I told him about Rick and how he'd probably fight this because it meant losing his income source. Dashiell nodded and said we'd need medical documentation of their incapacity and a clear paper trail showing Rick's refusal to help. He said if Rick contested it, we'd have to prove in court that I was acting in my parents' best interests, while Rick had abandoned them when they needed help most. I asked how long the process would take, and he said probably 6 to 8 weeks if Rick didn't contest it, longer if he fought it in court. I asked what happened to my parents during those 6 to 8 weeks, and Dashiell said that was the hard part, because legally they could still make their own decisions until a judge said otherwise. He gave me paperwork to fill out and a list of documents I'd need to gather. I scheduled a follow-up appointment for the next week and left his office feeling like I'd just enrolled in a graduate course on how to manage other people's disasters. My last stop was Dr. Alexandria Piper, my mother's primary care physician, to get the medical documentation Dashiell needed. The doctor's office was in a medical building near the hospital where my father was still recovering. I'd called ahead and explained what I needed, so the receptionist had me wait in an exam room instead of the lobby. Dr. Piper came in after about 10 minutes carrying my mother's chart and looking concerned. She was maybe 50 with short dark hair and the kind of direct manner that made you trust her immediately. She said she'd been treating my mother for 5 years and had watched the dementia progress from mild forgetfulness to significant cognitive impairment. She pulled out evaluation notes and test results and explained what each one meant in terms my mother couldn't understand anymore. She said Penelope needed supervised care now and it was only going to get worse. She asked where my mother was currently living, and I explained about the house in pre-foreclosure and my father in the hospital and Rick refusing to help. Dr. Piper's expression got harder, and she said she saw this situation too often, where family members who should help didn't, and the burden fell on the one person who'd been ignored their whole life. She wrote out detailed documentation of my mother's condition and signed off on forms saying Penelope couldn't make sound medical or financial decisions anymore. She said if I needed her to testify in court about my mother's capacity, she would do it gladly. I thanked her and took the documentation and felt grateful that at least one person in this whole mess was being straightforward and helpful. 2 days later, the hospital called to say my father was released. He had strict orders to reduce stress, follow up with cardiology in 2 weeks, take 6 different medications on specific schedules, and avoid any situation that might trigger another heart attack. The discharge nurse asked where he'd be going, and I realized I didn't have a good answer. He couldn't go back to the house that was in pre-foreclosure with no heat, because they hadn't paid the utility bills. He couldn't go to Rick's apartment because Rick had made it clear he wasn't helping. He couldn't go to a facility yet because we were still weeks away from Medicaid approval, and I didn't have the money for private pay placement. That left exactly one option that I'd been avoiding thinking about because I knew how hard it would be. I called Chloe from the hospital parking lot and told her I needed to bring my parents home to our guest room temporarily while we sorted out long-term placement. She was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear her thinking through what that would mean for our family and our 3 kids and our normal life. Then she said, okay, we'd make it work. Because that's what you do for family, even when that family never did it for you. She said to bring them home, and we'd figure out the rest together. I went back inside and told the discharge nurse my parents would be staying with me. She looked relieved because she'd probably been worried they'd end up homeless or back in the ER within a week. I signed all the discharge paperwork and got instructions for medication management and follow-up appointments. Then I drove to my parents' house to pack bags for both of them, because they couldn't do it themselves anymore. The house was cold because the heat had been shut off, and there were past due notices stuck to the front door. Inside, everything looked the same as it had my whole childhood, except sadder and more run down. I packed my father's medications and comfortable clothes and his reading glasses. I packed my mother's favorite sweater and the photo album she liked to look at even though she couldn't remember who was in the pictures anymore. I looked around at 30 years of enabling and bad decisions made physical in unpaid bills and empty rooms and furniture they'd bought with money they didn't have. Then I locked the door and drove back to the hospital to pick up my father. He looked small and old in the wheelchair the hospital required for discharge. I helped him into my car, and he didn't say anything about going to my house instead of his own. Maybe he was too tired to argue, or maybe he finally understood he didn't have any other options left. I drove home carefully because I didn't want to upset him, and went inside to find Chloe had already set up the guest room with fresh sheets and extra pillows. We got my father settled, and he fell asleep almost immediately. The next day, I picked up my mother from the memory care unit where she'd been staying during my father's hospitalization. She didn't recognize my car or remember why she was leaving, but she came with me anyway because the staff told her to. I got both my parents home and fed and medicated and into bed by 8 that night. Chloe and I sat on the couch afterward and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that would make this situation better or easier or less complicated. The next afternoon, Rick showed up at my house without calling first. I heard his car in the driveway and knew immediately this wasn't going to be a pleasant visit. I walked through the front door, and Rick was standing in my living room like he had a right to be there. Chloe must have let him in before she realized what was happening. My parents were asleep in the guest room down the hall, and I wanted to keep them that way. Rick looked around at the family photos on the walls and the kids' backpacks by the stairs like he was judging my life. I told him he needed to leave because this wasn't a good time. He said we needed to talk about Mom and Dad, and how I was making him look like a bad son. I asked him if he'd looked in a mirror lately because he was doing that all by himself. He started getting louder, and I moved between him and the hallway where my parents were sleeping. Chloe came in from the kitchen and stood next to me without saying anything. Rick said I was being selfish by taking Mom and Dad in without consulting him first. I reminded him that he'd refused to help when they asked, and that I'd made my decision without needing his input. He said they were his parents too, and he deserved to be part of the solution. I told him the solution was him paying back what they'd spent on him, or starting to contribute to their care costs. He went quiet for a second and then said I was being unreasonable and cruel. I asked him to leave again, and this time Chloe walked to the door and opened it. Rick looked at both of us and then walked out without another word. I locked the door behind him and stood there shaking because I was so angry. Chloe put her hand on my shoulder and said I'd done the right thing. The next morning, Gracie found me making breakfast and asked why Uncle Rick had been yelling in our house the night before. I hadn't realized she'd heard any of it. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at me with those serious eyes she gets when she's trying to understand something complicated. She asked why Uncle Rick never helped with anything but always got money from Grandma and Grandpa. I stopped cracking eggs and turned around to face her properly because this was important. I told her that sometimes parents make mistakes with their kids by giving them everything instead of teaching them how to work for things. I said Grandma and Grandpa had spent 30 years paying for Uncle Rick's life and never made him learn to take care of himself. Gracie asked if that was why he wouldn't help them now. I said yes, that when you never have to struggle or work hard, you don't learn how to be responsible or help other people. She was quiet for a minute and then asked if that's why I made her and her brothers do chores and earn their allowance. I told her exactly, that I wanted her to grow up knowing how to take care of herself and help the people she loved. She nodded like that made sense and then asked if Grandma and Grandpa were okay. I said they would be because we were going to help them, even though it was hard. Gracie got up and hugged me and said she was glad I wasn't like Uncle Rick. I hugged her back and felt proud of the person she was becoming. That week with my parents in the house was harder than I'd expected. My mother wandered at night looking for Rick and calling his name in the dark hallway. The first time it happened, I found her standing outside the guest room at 2 in the morning, confused about where she was. I guided her back to bed and she asked me 3 times where Rick was before falling asleep again. The second night, she made it all the way to the front door before I heard her. The third night, I started sleeping on the couch so I could catch her faster. My father kept trying to sneak foods his cardiologist had banned. I found him eating bacon he'd hidden in his suitcase and had to explain again why that was dangerous for his heart. He got angry and said he was tired of everyone telling him what to do. An hour later, he apologized and said he knew I was just trying to help. I caught him with a bag of chips the next day, and then with cookies the day after that. By the end of the week, I was exhausted from medication schedules and wandering and food battles and trying to keep my own family running normally. Chloe took over more with the kids, and they were amazing about the whole situation. But I could see the stress on everyone's faces. Then Declan called with news about a facility. He said he'd found a Medicaid pending bed at a decent assisted living place that could take both my parents. I felt relief flood through me until he explained the catch. I needed to cover 2 months of private pay while their Medicaid application processed through the system. He said the cost would be $11,000 total for both of them. I sat down at my desk and pulled up my business accounts on the computer. I looked at the numbers in my checking and savings and calculated what we had available. $11,000 was significant, but we could manage it without destroying everything we'd built. What made me angry was remembering that Rick had spent more than that on his last failed business idea, the cryptocurrency thing that had obviously been a scam from the start. My parents had handed over $12,000 for that without blinking. I closed the laptop and went to find Chloe. We sat in our bedroom with the door closed and I told her about the facility and the cost. She was quiet for a long time doing her own mental math about our finances. Then she said we should do it because this was about helping my parents, not punishing Rick. I said I knew that, but it still made me furious that we were paying because Rick wouldn't. She reminded me that Rick deserved consequences for his choices, but that shouldn't stop us from doing the right thing. I agreed and called Declan back to tell him we'd cover the 2 months. The next morning, I sat down with my parents at the kitchen table and told them about the facility. I explained that it was a good place with proper staff, and that I would pay for the first 2 months while Medicaid processed. My father started crying right there at the table with tears running down his face. He kept saying thank you over and over and reaching for my hand. My mother had one of her clear moments and looked at me with recognition in her eyes. She asked why I was helping them when Rick wouldn't. The question hung in the air and everyone went quiet. I took a breath and told her the truth. I said I was helping because I was a better person than they'd raised Rick to be. I said that unlike them, I believed in helping people who actually needed it, rather than people who just wanted it. My mother's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly, like she understood. My father looked down at the table and didn't say anything. The moment passed and my mother's clarity faded, but the truth had been spoken. We scheduled a tour of the facility for the next day. The building was older but clean with wide hallways and good lighting. My father walked slowly through the common areas looking at everything carefully. The dining room had big windows and the residents sitting there looked well cared for. There was a memory care unit on the second floor with a separate locked entrance and staff trained specifically for dementia patients. The woman giving us the tour explained that my mother could start in regular assisted living and transfer to memory care when she needed it. My father seemed relieved by that and kept asking questions about the staff ratios and mealtimes. My mother liked the garden area in the back with raised beds and benches. She sat on one of the benches and smiled at the flowers even though it was too early in the season for most of them to be blooming. After the tour, we met with the intake coordinator in her office. She spread paperwork across the desk and explained all the requirements and forms. I was listed as primary contact and financial guarantor. She asked about other family members and I said there was a son, but he wouldn't be involved in the care arrangements. She wrote that down without asking questions. Rick's name appeared nowhere on any of the documents per my specific instruction. I signed everything and wrote the check for the first month. My parents would move in the following week. That night, my father called Rick from our house phone to tell him about the facility. I didn't know he was making the call until I heard his voice from the guest room. 20 minutes later, my phone rang with Rick's number. I answered, and he immediately started demanding to know why he wasn't consulted about the facility placement. His voice was loud and angry through the phone. I told him calmly that people who refused to help didn't get consulted about solutions. He said I had no right to make decisions about his parents without including him. I said I had every right because I was the one paying for it and taking responsibility while he did nothing. He threatened to call the facility and tell them I was acting without family consensus. I told him to go ahead and that I'd be happy to explain to them exactly why his name wasn't on any paperwork. He hung up on me again, and I put my phone down feeling tired, but certain I'd made the right choice. Rick called 3 days later with his voice shaking with rage. He said he was going to report me to Adult Protective Services for elder abuse and financial exploitation. He said I was taking advantage of our parents in their vulnerable state and manipulating them when they couldn't think clearly. I laughed out loud and heard him sputter on the other end. I told him I had documented everything, including his refusal to help when the hospital social worker asked him directly. I said I had copies of every bill they'd paid for him over the past 5 years and statements from medical professionals about their conditions. I told him he was welcome to call anyone he wanted because I had nothing to hide. He hung up without another word, and I went back to making dinner for my parents. Dashiell and I met at his office the next morning to file for power of attorney. He had prepared all the paperwork and just needed my signature on multiple forms. I brought the folder with all my mother's medical records from Alexandria and my father's discharge papers from his heart attack. Dashiell reviewed everything carefully and said we had a strong case given their documented medical needs and Rick's clear refusal to assist. He filed the petition that afternoon, and we got a court date for 2 weeks out. The judge reviewed the medical documentation and the written statement from the hospital social worker about Rick refusing to co-sign for the assisted living facility. She asked if any family members were contesting the petition, and Dashiell said we expected opposition from my brother. The judge granted temporary power of attorney immediately and scheduled a full hearing for the following month. Rick filed his contest exactly 1 week later, just like Dashiell predicted he would. The paperwork claimed he had been willing to help all along, but I had deliberately excluded him from decisions about our parents' care. It said I was acting out of spite and trying to control their finances for my own benefit. Dashiell read the filing and shook his head. He said Rick's attorney had written a standard contest without any actual evidence to back up the claims. We spent the next 3 weeks preparing for the hearing and gathering every piece of documentation we could find. The courthouse was cold and smelled like floor cleaner when we arrived for the hearing. Rick sat on the opposite side of the room with his lawyer looking uncomfortable in a suit that didn't fit right. My parents weren't required to attend given their medical conditions, which was a relief. The judge called the case and Rick's attorney stood up first. He argued that Rick had always been involved in our parents' care and that I had frozen him out of important decisions. He said Rick was financially stable and willing to help, but I wouldn't let him. I watched Rick nod along to everything his lawyer said and felt nothing but disgust. Dashiell stood when it was our turn and placed a folder on the table in front of the judge. He pulled out bank statements showing 30 years of payments from my parents to Rick totaling over $500,000. He showed the notebook I'd been keeping with documented expenses from the past year alone. He presented written statements from the hospital social worker describing her conversation with Rick, where he explicitly refused to co-sign for the assisted living facility. He showed the intake coordinator's notes from when I toured the facility, stating that Rick's name was intentionally left off all paperwork per his own request. The judge reviewed everything silently for 15 minutes while Rick shifted in his seat. She asked Rick directly if he had contributed any money to our parents' care in the past 6 months. He said he hadn't been asked to contribute. She asked if he had offered to help financially. He said he assumed I had it handled. She asked if he had visited them in the hospital. He said he'd been busy with work. She looked at him for a long moment and then ruled in my favor. The whole hearing took 20 minutes. My parents moved into the assisted living facility the following week. I helped them unpack their belongings in 2 small rooms that would be their home now. My father seemed relieved to be somewhere stable with people to help him manage his medications. He walked down to the dining room that first evening and came back talking about a man named George who used to work construction. My mother liked the activities coordinator who led gentle exercise classes in the morning. She couldn't always remember participating in the classes, but she seemed happy during them. The memory care unit upstairs was ready whenever she needed it, but for now she could stay in regular assisted living with my father nearby. The facility social worker pulled me aside during my second visit. She said my parents talked about me constantly during their check-ins and orientation sessions. They told stories about my business and my kids and seemed genuinely proud of what I'd accomplished. She said it was clear they recognized they'd made mistakes with how they'd raised my brother. I thanked her and felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. The pride was real now, but it came 30 years too late to mean what it should have meant. Rick showed up at the facility 3 weeks after my parents moved in. I was visiting when he walked into my father's room looking uncertain. My father was sitting in his chair by the window and his face went still when he saw Rick. They talked quietly for a few minutes and then my father said something I'd never heard him say before. He told Rick he was disappointed in how he'd handled everything with their care situation. He said Rick had let them down when they needed him most, and that wasn't how family treated each other. Rick's face went red and he started making excuses, but my father cut him off. He said excuses were all Rick had ever given and he was tired of hearing them. I stayed quiet in the corner and watched 30 years of enabling finally crack. My mother was having one of her clear days and asked to see Rick before he left. I walked with him to her room and she smiled when we came in. She took Rick's hand and told him she loved him, but she was sorry. She said she and my father had failed him by never making him learn to take care of himself. She said they'd done him a terrible thing by always fixing his problems and never letting him struggle. Rick pulled his hand away and said they'd helped him because they loved him. My mother shook her head slowly and said, "Real love meant preparing your children for life without you." Rick left upset and I didn't see him at the facility again for over a month. Lucas met me at a coffee shop to go over my parents' ongoing finances. He had spreadsheets showing their Social Security payments and my father's small pension from his years working at the manufacturing plant. With Medicaid covering most of the facility costs, the monthly shortfall was manageable at around $300. I could handle that without destroying my own family's budget. Lucas helped me set up automatic payments and a system for tracking medical expenses that weren't covered. He said my parents would be fine financially as long as nothing major changed with their health. I felt relieved knowing they were stable even if the stability had come at such a high cost. The house my parents had lived in for 40 years was in pre-foreclosure and needed to be dealt with quickly. I contacted a real estate agent who specialized in short sales and explained the situation. The bank agreed to accept less than what was owed to avoid the foreclosure process. We listed the house and it sold within 2 weeks to a young couple who didn't know its history. After paying off the first and second mortgages, there was no equity left. Nothing to split between Rick and me. Nothing to show for 40 years of payments. I signed the papers and handed over the keys and felt nothing, but relief that it was done. I scheduled a weekend to clear out their house and found Rick's life failures packed in boxes throughout every room. The spare bedroom held equipment from the food truck business that never opened, still wrapped in plastic with price tags attached, showing my parents spent $14,000 on a commercial grill and prep station Rick never used once. The garage was stacked with inventory from the clothing line, boxes of shirts with Rick's face printed on them in a design so bad I couldn't believe he'd actually approved it. I counted the boxes and did the math. Over $8,000 worth of merchandise that never sold a single unit. The basement had cryptocurrency mining equipment from his scam venture, computers and graphics cards and cooling systems that cost my parents at least $20,000, based on the receipts I found in a folder labeled Rick's Business Investment. He'd left all of it here when each venture failed, never bothered to pick up his own stuff or deal with the consequences of his failures. I called Rick and told him he had 1 week to collect everything, or I was donating it all to whoever would take it. He showed up 6 days later with a rental truck, late afternoon on a Saturday when he probably hoped I wouldn't be there. I was there. I watched from the porch as he loaded box after box, his movements quick and jerky like he wanted to finish fast and leave. He wouldn't look at me, kept his eyes down or on the boxes, his face red the whole time. When he finished loading the last box, I asked if he ever felt bad about leaving all his expensive failures for Mom and Dad to the store while they struggled to pay their own bills. He got in the truck without answering and drove away. 2 weeks later, I had my father's follow-up appointment with his heart doctor, and the news was surprisingly good. The doctor reviewed the test results and said my father's heart function was improving with the medication routine they'd established. His blood pressure was better. His stress test showed improvement, and the doctor seemed pleased with how stable everything looked. He said the reduced stress from living in a structured environment with regular meals and medication management was helping my father's recovery more than he'd initially expected. My father smiled when the doctor said that, the first real smile I'd seen from him in months. 3 months into their stay at the facility, the staff called me in for a meeting about my mother. The head nurse explained gently that my mother's dementia had progressed enough that she needed to move to the memory care unit. She was wandering more, getting confused about where she was, sometimes not recognizing the other residents or even my father during his visits. I felt sad watching them move her belongings to the new room, but the memory care staff seemed kind and well-trained. When I visited her that evening, she was sitting in a common area with other residents, working on a simple puzzle, and she seemed content even if she didn't fully understand where she was. The structure and routine of the memory care unit appeared to suit her better than the regular assisted living floor where she'd been getting frustrated by her confusion. My phone rang while I was making dinner and Rick's name showed on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. He asked if I could lend him money for rent, said he was short this month and his landlord was threatening eviction. I asked how much and he said $2,000. I laughed and told him no, said maybe he should try getting a job like normal adults do instead of calling family members for bailouts. He called me cruel and said I was just like our parents now, punishing him for needing help. I said our parents never punished him for anything, and that was exactly the problem. He hung up on me. The next time I visited my father at the facility, he asked to talk privately, and we went to his room. He sat in his chair by the window and told me something I never expected to hear. He said that before my mother's memory got too bad, they'd had several conversations about me and Rick and how they'd handled everything over the years. He said they both agreed they'd made terrible mistakes with how they'd treated me compared to Rick. They'd been wrong to give him everything while expecting me to manage on my own, wrong to excuse his behavior while criticizing mine, wrong to enable him instead of preparing him for real life. My father looked at me with tears in his eyes and said he was sorry. I told him I appreciated the apology, but I was still angry about decades of being treated like I mattered less than Rick. I said I was glad they finally recognized their mistakes, but it didn't erase 30 years of feeling invisible while they focused everything on my brother. My father nodded slowly and said he understood completely. He said I had every right to be angry and he didn't expect forgiveness, just wanted me to know they'd realized how wrong they'd been. We sat quietly for a while and I felt something shift. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of letting go of some of the hurt. That Saturday morning, Gracie came into the kitchen while I was having coffee and asked if she could volunteer at the assisted living facility on weekends. I was surprised and asked why she wanted to do that. She said watching how I'd handled everything with Grandma and Grandpa had taught her about real responsibility and what it meant to take care of family even when it was hard. She said she wanted to help other families going through similar situations and learn more about elder care. I felt proud of my daughter in a way my parents had never been proud of me. Proud that she'd learned these lessons about responsibility and service by watching me instead of being taught that the world would always bail her out. I told her yes and said I'd volunteer with her, so we could do it together. We started spending Saturday mornings at the facility, helping with activities and visiting residents who didn't have family nearby. Gracie was natural with the older residents, patient and kind, and I watched her grow into someone I admired. On a Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize, and I answered to find Rick's landlord on the line. He introduced himself and asked if I'd be willing to co-sign a new lease for Rick since the current one was ending, and Rick's rental history had some issues. I laughed out loud and said absolutely not. The landlord seemed taken aback and asked if I was sure because Rick had listed me as his emergency contact and family reference. I told the landlord he should try asking Rick's parents to co-sign, and when he asked for their contact information, I gave him the assisted living facility's address and phone number. I explained that Rick's parents were currently in assisted living because Rick had refused to help them when they needed him most, so perhaps the landlord would understand why I wasn't interested in taking on financial responsibility for my brother. The landlord hung up without another word. 2 weeks later, the facility director stopped me in the hallway during my regular visit. She smiled and told me my parents were model residents, and that many families struggled with the adjustment much more than ours had. I nodded and thanked her, but didn't mention that the struggle happened before they moved in, not after. The adjustment period for my parents were easy compared to the decades of dysfunction that led to them needing care in the first place. I walked to my father's room and found him reading the newspaper in his chair by the window. He looked healthier than he had in months and seemed content in his small space. My phone buzzed with Rick's number, and I stepped into the hallway to answer. He was crying and talking fast, saying he'd been evicted from his condo for not paying rent and needed somewhere to stay temporarily. He promised it would only be a few weeks until he figured things out and found a new place. I told him no. I said he was an adult who needed to figure out his own housing situation, just like every other adult in the world did when they couldn't pay their bills. He started yelling that I was heartless and cruel and didn't care if he ended up on the street. I hung up and blocked his number before going back to visit my father. The next Saturday, my father asked if I was going to help Rick with his eviction situation. I looked at him carefully and asked if he was serious. He said Rick was struggling and maybe needed some support to get back on his feet. I reminded him that helping Rick is exactly what got them into this mess in the first place. I told him Rick was 48 years old and needed to solve his own problems for once in his life, instead of expecting everyone else to fix things for him. My father looked uncomfortable but didn't argue. He changed the subject to the facility's upcoming holiday party and asked if I'd be bringing the kids. 3 weeks later, I heard through my father that Rick had moved into a cheap apartment with roommates for the first time in his entire life. My father worried about him constantly and kept asking if I'd checked on Rick or offered to help him get furniture or kitchen supplies. I reminded him every single time that this was what normal adults did when they couldn't afford to live alone. They found roommates, they bought secondhand furniture, they learned to budget and cook and clean for themselves. Rick was experiencing regular adult life at 48, and it wasn't my job to cushion that experience for him. 4 months after my parents moved into the facility, my father told me during a visit that Rick had gotten a job. It was part-time retail at a sporting goods store, and Rick complained constantly about having to stand all day and deal with customers and follow a schedule. But he was actually working for the first time in years and getting a paycheck that he had to earn through his own effort. My father seemed proud but also worried that the job was too much stress for Rick. I told him the job was probably the best thing that had ever happened to Rick because he finally had to show up for something besides himself. The following Tuesday, the facility called and said my mother was having a rare clear day and was asking to see Rick. I texted Rick the information, and he showed up that afternoon looking tired and wearing his work uniform. I watched from the doorway as my mother hugged him and told him she loved him. Then she said she was glad he finally had a job and that she should have made him work decades ago instead of letting him stay home and do nothing. She said it was her fault he never learned to take care of himself, and she was sorry for that. Rick looked stunned and didn't know what to say. He left 20 minutes later without saying goodbye to anyone. After that, Rick started visiting more regularly, maybe once a week instead of once a month. He brought my father magazines about fishing and helped my mother get to the facility activities when she was having good days. He pushed her wheelchair to bingo and sat with her during the movie screenings in the common room. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd ever done for them before. I met with Dashel one afternoon to go over the remaining legal details of my parents' situation. He helped me set up a small trust for my parents' final expenses, using the last of their assets. It wasn't much, maybe $8,000 total, but it meant I wouldn't have to cover funeral costs when the time came. Dashel said I'd done everything possible to protect my parents and give them stability in their final years. 6 months after moving into the facility, my father's health had stabilized enough that he could participate in the group outings. He went to the local museum and the botanical gardens and seemed genuinely happy. During one visit, he told me he was actually happier now than he'd been before everything fell apart, despite losing his house and his independence. He said he didn't have constant money stress anymore and didn't have to worry about Rick calling with another crisis or another failed business idea. He could just exist without the weight of decades of bad decisions crushing him. I realized something important sitting there with my father in his small room at the assisted living facility. By forcing boundaries and refusing to enable Rick, I'd actually helped my whole family more than continuing the old patterns ever would have. It was hard, and it hurt, and there were moments I questioned whether I was being too harsh. But it was the right thing to do. Rick was working and supporting himself. My parents were safe and cared for. My own family was stable, and my kids were learning what healthy boundaries looked like. The pattern had finally broken after 30 years, and everyone was better for it, even if the process of breaking it had been painful for all of us. 6 months passed, and my business pulled in more money than it ever had before. I checked the quarterly reports 3 times because the numbers looked wrong, but they were right. Without the constant phone calls about my parents' crisis and Rick's latest disaster, I could focus on actual work instead of putting out fires. Chloe and I went on a real vacation for the first time in years, just the 2 of us for a long weekend while my parents' friends watched the kids. We sat on a beach, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this relaxed. The kids noticed too. Gracie told me one morning that she liked how our house felt calmer now, and that she understood why I'd made the choices I did with Grandma and Grandpa. She said her friend's family had similar problems with an uncle who never grew up, and watching me handle everything taught her what real responsibility looked like. I hugged her and felt proud of the example I'd set, even though the process had been brutal. Rick texted me on a Tuesday afternoon asking if we could meet for coffee. I stared at the message for 10 minutes before responding that I'd meet him at the cafe near my office on Thursday. He showed up on time wearing his work uniform from the retail store, looking tired in a way I'd never seen before. We sat down with our drinks, and he didn't make small talk or waste time. He apologized for how he'd handled everything with Mom and Dad, said the words clearly, and looked me in the eye while doing it. He told me working and paying his own bills was harder than he'd ever imagined, and that he should have learned it 30 years ago instead of now. He said he understood why I'd refused to help him, and that I'd been right about everything even though it had felt cruel at the time. I listened without interrupting and let him finish completely. I told Rick I forgave him because holding on to anger wasn't helping anyone anymore. But I also told him the truth, that our relationship would never be what it could have been if he'd grown up sooner. Too many years had passed with too much resentment built up between us. We'd lost decades of being actual siblings because Mom and Dad had made him their project instead of their son. He nodded and said he accepted that, said he was trying to be better now even if it was late. That was all I could ask for at this point. We finished our coffee and he went back to work, and I went back to my office and life continued. My parents were safe in their facility with trained staff managing Dad's heart condition and Mom's dementia. Rick was supporting himself with a real job and real bills and real responsibilities for the first time in his life. My family was stable and growing, and my kids were learning what healthy relationships actually looked like. I'd learned something important through all of this. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable people even when they're family, even when they beg, even when it hurts. My parents had wanted me to keep their comfortable lives going forever, to pretend Rick's dependence was normal and my sacrifice was expected. But that wasn't love. It was just easy. What I'd done was hard and messy and painful for everyone involved. It wasn't the ending my parents had wanted when they'd come to me crying and desperate, but it was the ending their choices had created over 30 years of putting comfort over growth. I was at peace with how I'd handled everything, with the boundaries I'd set and the lines I'd drawn. My family was thriving because I'd finally said no.